My narcissist ex swore he was irreplaceable. Then I became his boss's boss, and let me tell you, the look on his face when he realized what had happened was worth every sleepless night, every tear, every moment I spent plotting his professional downfall. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 years ago, I thought Derek was the love of my life. 6'2", designer stubble, the kind of confidence that made you forget he was actually shorter than most doorways. He worked in marketing at this mid-sized tech company downtown, always talking about his big projects, and how the company would collapse without his creative genius. I should have seen the red flags flapping in my face like surrender banners. The thing about narcissists, and trust me, I'm practically a PhD in Derek studies now, is that they don't just break up with you. Oh no, that would be too clean, too simple. They have to make it a whole fucking production, complete with a soliloquy about why you're the problem and they're God's gift to humanity. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd bought groceries for the week, spent my lunch break picking out his favorite beer, that expensive IPA he claimed was complex, but tasted like someone had dissolved a pine tree in carbonated water. I was excited to tell him about my promotion interview scheduled for Thursday, finally moving up from junior analyst to senior analyst at my consulting firm. The apartment smelled like the vanilla candles I'd lit, trying to make everything perfect for when he got home. My laptop was open on the coffee table, still showing the Excel spreadsheet where I'd been tracking our shared expenses, because yes, I was that girlfriend. The one who organized everything, who remembered his mother's birthday, who made sure his shirts were picked up from the dry cleaner. I heard his key in the lock around 7:30, later than usual. My heart did that stupid flutter thing it always did when he came home, like I was 16 and seeing my crush in the hallway. The door opened and I could feel the shift in energy before I even saw his face. You know that feeling when the air pressure changes right before a storm? That electrical charge that makes your skin prickle? It was like that, but worse, because storms are honest about their intentions. Derek walked in wearing his work clothes, navy blue button-down, khakis that cost more than my rent, leather shoes that probably had their own insurance policy. But his expression? Christ. His expression looked like he'd just been forced to eat something that had died in the sun. He didn't say hello, didn't kiss me, just stood there in the doorway like he was calculating the square footage of his own personal hell. My stomach dropped. I knew. Before he said a word, before he opened that perfect mouth with its perfect teeth that I'd helped pay to get whitened, I knew, we need to talk. His voice had that flat, rehearsed quality that meant he'd been practicing this conversation in his car. Probably had talking points. The laptop screen dimmed to black as I sat there, watching him pace our living room like a caged animal. Our living room, with the couch we'd picked out together, the throw pillows I'd bought because he said they tied the room together, the framed photo of us from last Christmas where his arm was around my waist, and we both looked genuinely happy. Funny how quickly happiness becomes evidence of your own stupidity. This isn't working, he said, not looking at me. Classic Derek move. Delivered devastating news while examining the ceiling like it contained the secrets of the universe. I've been thinking about it for weeks and we're not compatible. Not compatible. Like we were computer programs having trouble syncing. My throat felt like I'd swallowed glass. What do you mean, not compatible? Yesterday you were talking about meeting my parents next month. That was before I really thought about it. He ran his hand through his hair, that gesture that used to make me weak in the knees. Now it just looked practiced, like he'd been rehearsing that too. You're great, Sarah, but you're not what I need for where I'm going in life. Where he was going in life. As if life were a destination you could GPS your way to, and I was somehow a roadblock instead of a passenger. I felt my chest tightening, that familiar panic response that starts behind your ribcage and spreads outward like spilled wine. Can we talk about this? I don't understand what changed. Nothing changed. That's the problem. His voice was getting that edge it got when he was about to say something cruel and pass it off as honesty. You're comfortable, Sarah. You're safe. But I need someone who challenges me, someone who's on my level professionally, on his level professionally. The words hit me like a slap. I'd supported him through his creative blocks, listened to him complain about his coworkers for hours, helped him practice presentations in our bathroom mirror. I'd celebrated every minor victory at his job like he'd cured cancer, made dinner on his late nights, rubbed his shoulders when he was stressed about deadlines. But I wasn't on his level. I got promoted to senior analyst, I said quietly, hating how small my voice sounded. I was going to tell you tonight. He actually laughed. Not a happy laugh. one of those sharp, dismissive sounds that cuts through the air like broken glass. Senior analyst at a consulting firm? Sarah, I'm talking about real ambition, real success. I need someone who thinks bigger than this. This, our life, our apartment, me. My hands were shaking now, and I pressed them against my thighs to make them stop. So what, you're breaking up with me because I'm not ambitious enough? Because I don't make enough money? It's not about money. But the way he said it, looking around our apartment with barely concealed distaste, suggested it was absolutely about money. It's about drive, vision. I have goals, Sarah. Big goals. And I need a partner who can match that energy. The thing about being with a narcissist is that they make you doubt your own memory. They'll rewrite history right in front of you, so confidently that you start wondering if you imagined everything that came before. But I remembered. I remembered him telling me I was amazing, that he'd never met anyone like me, that I was exactly what he'd been looking for his whole life. Apparently, what he'd been looking for was someone to kill time with until someone better came along. Is there someone else? The question fell out of my mouth before I could stop it, and I immediately wanted to take it back. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I could see the answer in his face. His pause was a confession. It's not like that, he said, which was Derek speak for, yes, absolutely, but I'm going to make it sound like a coincidence. I've met someone who gets it. Gets me. We connect on a different level. Gets it. Gets him. I wanted to ask what it was, what secret code this other woman had cracked that I'd been too stupid to figure out. But I already knew. She probably made more money, had a better title, drove a car that didn't make weird noises when she turned left. My vision was getting blurry and I realized I was crying. Not the pretty, single-tear kind of crying you see in movies, but the ugly, snotty kind that makes your face red and puffy. Derek looked at me like I was confirming every reason he'd decided to leave. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, and I could hear the impatience creeping into his voice. We both knew this wasn't forever. We both knew. Speak for yourself, asshole. I need you to pack your things, I managed to say, proud of how steady my voice sounded despite the fact that my entire world was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Actually, Derek said, and I could tell by his tone that he was about to make this worse, I think it makes more sense for you to move out. This place is closer to my office, and with my career trajectory, get out. The words came out louder than I intended, sharp enough to cut through his self-important rambling. Get your shit and get out. Now. He looked genuinely surprised, like he'd expected me to roll over and accommodate his career trajectory one last time. Sarah, be reasonable. We can work out the logistics like adults. Get out. This time I was screaming and it felt good. It felt like finally standing up for myself after months of making myself smaller to fit into his idea of what I should be. Derek grabbed his work bag and a few items from the bedroom, muttering about how I was being dramatic and unreasonable. On his way out, he paused at the door, probably expecting some final moment of reconciliation or at least civility. Instead, he said the words that would haunt me for weeks and fuel every decision I made afterward. You know what your problem is, Sarah? You think you're irreplaceable, but you're not. Nobody is, especially not you. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than my screaming. I stood there in the sudden silence, surrounded by the detritus of our relationship, his coffee mug still on the counter, his jacket still hanging on the back of the chair, the grocery bag with his expensive beer still sitting on the kitchen island like a monument to my own stupidity. Irreplaceable. The word echoed in my head as I slumped onto the couch, as I stared at our Christmas photo until my eyes burned, as I finally understood that everything I'd thought was real had been an elaborate performance where I was the only one who didn't know I was acting. He thought I was replaceable. Funny thing about underestimating people, it usually comes back to bite you in the ass. But that night, sitting in our apartment that was now just my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of how completely I'd been played, I had no idea that Derek had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. I had no idea that in exactly 18 months, I'd be walking into his office building as his new boss's boss, holding his career in my hands like a house of cards I could topple with a single breath. All I knew was that I was alone. I was angry, and for the first time in our entire relationship, Derek had finally told me something that was 100% true. I was going to prove exactly how replaceable he was. The first week after Derek left, I lived on a steady diet of ice cream, wine, and pure, unadulterated rage. I called in sick to work twice, which wasn't technically lying since heartbreak apparently counts as a legitimate illness that makes you physically nauseous and mentally useless. I spent hours analyzing every conversation we'd ever had, picking apart each interaction like a forensic investigator at a crime scene, looking for clues I'd missed. The worst part wasn't even the breakup itself. It was the slow, humiliating realization of how blind I'd been. Every memory was tainted now, every sweet moment recontextualized as manipulation or, worse, pity. That time he'd surprised me with dinner after a rough day at work? Probably guilt because he was already texting someone else. The weekend he'd suggested we stay in instead of going to my company party suddenly seemed less romantic and more like he was embarrassed to be seen with me in front of my colleagues. I found myself obsessing over the phrase, "on my level professionally." It played on repeat in my head like a broken record, each repetition making me angrier. Derek worked in marketing at TechFlow Solutions, creating campaigns for B2B software that helped other companies manage their customer relationships. Hardly revolutionary stuff. His biggest career achievement was a campaign that increased click-through rates by 0.3%, which he'd talked about for months like he'd personally invented the internet. Meanwhile, I was building financial models for Fortune 500 companies, analyzing market trends, making recommendations that affected million-dollar decisions. But sure, Derek, I wasn't on your level professionally. I wasn't thinking big enough. The turning point came on a Thursday evening, exactly 9 days after Derek's grand exit. I was sitting on my couch in my pajamas at 7 p.m., holding a glass of wine and staring at my laptop screen. I'd been mindlessly scrolling through LinkedIn, which in hindsight was probably the digital equivalent of picking at a scab, when I saw it. Derek's new relationship status. In a relationship with Amanda Chen. My cursor hovered over her profile like a moth drawn to a particularly bright flame. Amanda Chen, Senior Vice President of Business Development at Morrison & Associates, MBA from Wharton, 6-figure salary, judging by her job title and the company she worked for. Professional headshot that screamed, "I close deals and take names." The kind of woman who probably had her retirement portfolio optimized and her networking strategy mapped out 5 years in advance. So that was it. That was the someone who gets it Derek had been talking about. Amanda fucking Chen, who definitely thought bigger than this being our life, our relationship, me. I clicked through her photos, hating myself for doing it but unable to stop. There she was at industry conferences, shaking hands with executives whose names I recognized from business magazines, at charity galas, wearing dresses that cost more than my monthly rent, in what appeared to be Derek's apartment, my former apartment, looking perfectly at home in the space I'd helped decorate. The photo that broke me was from 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Derek had his arm around Amanda at some upscale restaurant, both of them laughing at something off camera. He was wearing the shirt I'd bought him for his birthday, the one he'd claimed was too nice for everyday wear. Apparently it was just too nice for everyday wear with me. I sat there staring at this picture of my replacement, this successful, accomplished, ambitious replacement, and something shifted inside me. The heartbreak was still there, raw and aching, but underneath it was something else, something harder, something that tasted like metal and burned like acid. Derek had discarded me like I was a practice girlfriend, a warm-up act for the main event. He'd looked at my life, my career, my dreams, and found them lacking. Not good enough for his trajectory, not ambitious enough for his vision. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking, here's the thing about revenge that no one tells you. It starts as an impulse, a flash of anger that makes you want to key someone's car or post their embarrassing secrets on social media. But real revenge, the kind that actually matters, requires patience, strategy. It requires you to think 10 moves ahead, like chess, but with higher stakes and better payoff. I wasn't going to slash Derek's tires or send angry texts to Amanda Chen. That was small-time, amateur-hour bullshit that would make me look crazy and give them something to bond over. Can you believe my psycho ex is stalking us? No thank you. I was going to do something much worse. I was going to become everything Derek claimed I wasn't. I was going to become so fucking successful that his dismissal of me would look like the biggest professional misjudgment since someone told the Beatles they'd never make it in America. The next morning, I put on my best suit and walked into my boss Catherine's office with a proposal I'd been crafting in my head all night. "I want to talk about the Morrison and Associates account," I said, closing the door behind me. Catherine looked up from her computer, eyebrows raised. Morrison and Associates was our biggest potential client, a massive consulting firm that specialized in corporate restructuring. They'd been circling us for months, interested in our financial analysis services but hesitant to commit to a partnership. Landing them would be a career-defining move for whoever managed the account. "What about Morrison and Associates?" Catherine asked. "I want to lead the pitch," I said. "I know it's above my pay grade, but I have some ideas that could change their mind about working with us." Catherine leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of intense focus that made her such a good manager. She was in her early 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who'd climbed the corporate ladder when it was even harder for women to get anywhere near the top. She didn't suffer fools, didn't hand out opportunities based on potential, and didn't make emotional decisions. "The Morrison account is worth $12 million annually," she said slowly. "If we land it. If we don't, we've wasted 6 months of resources and potentially damaged our reputation with other prospects. I understand the stakes. Do you?" She leaned forward. "Because this isn't a normal client pitch, Sarah. This is about proving we can handle enterprise-level consulting. The partners they'd be working with would be senior VPs and C-suite executives, people with 20 years more experience than you. Then it's a good thing I learn fast." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see her calculating risks and benefits in her head. Finally, she spoke. "What makes you think you can succeed where our senior partners have been struggling?" I'd been hoping she'd ask that question. "Because I've been studying their business model for the past week," I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared. "Morrison and Associates specializes in corporate restructuring, but they're not just cutting costs, they're trying to help companies pivot to new markets, new technologies. They need financial analysis that's forward-looking, not just diagnostic." I opened the folder and showed her the preliminary analysis I'd put together. "Our current pitch focuses on what we can tell them about their past performance. What they really need is someone who can help them model future scenarios for their clients. I've identified 3 specific service gaps where we could provide value they can't get anywhere else." Catherine flipped through my analysis, her expression unreadable. I'd spent 3 sleepless nights putting it together, diving deep into Morrison's recent case studies, analyzing their client portfolio, identifying patterns in their approach that suggested opportunities for partnership. "This is good work," she said finally. "But it's preliminary, theoretical. Actually landing Morrison would require months of relationship building, detailed proposal development, presentations to multiple decision-makers." "I know," I said, "and I'm ready for all of that." She looked at me for another long moment. "What's really going on here, Sarah? 2 weeks ago, you were happy with your analyst role, talking about work-life balance and not wanting to travel too much. Now you're asking to lead our most important business development initiative. What changed? What changed was that my boyfriend dumped me for someone more successful and told me I wasn't ambitious enough. What changed was that I'd spent 9 days feeling sorry for myself before realizing that the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting promoted. But I couldn't say that to Catherine, not if I wanted her to take me seriously. I realized I was selling myself short. I said instead, "I've been playing it safe, staying in my comfort zone. But I'm capable of more than I've been showing." It wasn't technically a lie. Derek's brutal assessment of my ambition had forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how I'd been approaching my career. I had been playing it safe, accepting incremental progress instead of pushing for the opportunities I actually wanted. Catherine nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Here's what we'll do. You'll work on the Morrison pitch as a joint project with David and Jennifer." David and Jennifer were senior partners, both with MBAs and 15-plus years of experience. You'll take the lead on the financial modeling and market analysis components. If your work impresses Morrison's team and helps us land the account, we'll talk about fast-tracking your promotion to principal consultant. Principal consultant? 2 levels above my current position, with a salary bump that would put me firmly in 6-figure territory. It was exactly the kind of advancement that Derek claimed I wasn't ambitious enough to pursue. "Thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice professional despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I won't let you down." "I hope not," Catherine said. "Because if this doesn't work out, it won't just affect your career trajectory. It'll affect mine too. Over the next 3 months, I threw myself into the Morrison project with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for Olympic training or religious fanaticism. I studied every piece of public information about their company, analyzed their competitors, researched their key executives, memorized their recent case studies. I built financial models that were so detailed and sophisticated that David admitted he'd learned new techniques just from reviewing my work. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered something interesting about Morrison's client acquisition strategy. They were expanding aggressively into mid-market companies, businesses that were too big for basic consulting, but too small for the white-glove treatment from top-tier firms like McKinsey or Bain. It was a smart move, but it created a specific challenge. They needed to deliver high-quality analysis at scale, which meant they needed partners who could provide specialized expertise without the overhead of hiring full-time staff. I spent weeks developing a service model that would address this exact need. Instead of just offering our traditional consulting services, I proposed a hybrid approach. We'd embed our analysts directly into Morrison's project teams for specific engagements, providing specialized financial expertise while learning their methodologies and building long-term relationships. It was ambitious, complex, and exactly the kind of thinking bigger that Derek claimed I was incapable of. The pitch meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in December, almost exactly 3 months after Derek's dramatic exit from my life. I'd barely slept the night before, running through my presentation over and over, anticipating questions, preparing for objections. This wasn't just about landing a client anymore. It was about proving something to myself, and maybe, if I'm being honest, proving something to Derek too. Morrison's team arrived at our office at 10 a.m. sharp. 3 executives in perfectly tailored suits, carrying leather portfolios and the kind of confident energy that comes from holding million-dollar budgets. The lead was Patricia Morrison herself, company founder, Harvard MBA, the kind of woman who'd built an empire by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else in the room. "Ms. Klein," she said, shaking my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "I've been looking forward to seeing what you've prepared for us." What I'd prepared was 90 minutes of the most comprehensive, innovative, strategically brilliant presentation of my entire career. I walked them through market analysis that revealed opportunities they hadn't considered, financial models that quantified the value of partnerships they'd been evaluating qualitatively, and implementation timelines that showed exactly how our collaboration would work in practice. But the moment that changed everything came during the Q&A session when Patricia asked about scalability. "This all sounds impressive in theory," she said, "but how do we know your team can handle the volume and complexity of work we'd be sending your way? We're not looking for vendors. We're looking for strategic partners who can grow with us." I looked at David and Jennifer, waiting for one of them to answer. They looked back at me expectantly. Apparently this one was mine. "You're absolutely right to be concerned about scalability," I said, "which is why I'd like to propose something unconventional." I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation slide I'd prepared, but hadn't planned to use unless the conversation went exactly this direction. "What if we started with a pilot program? Choose 3 of your current client engagements, different industries, different complexity levels. We'll embed one of our analysts into each project team for the full engagement cycle. You get to test our capabilities in real-world conditions, we get to learn your processes and prove our value. After 6 months, we evaluate the results and decide whether to expand the partnership." Patricia leaned forward. "And you'd be willing to staff these pilot projects with your senior people?" Here was the moment. The question I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "Actually," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "I'd like to lead one of the pilot projects myself." The room went quiet. Even David and Jennifer looked surprised. This wasn't part of what we'd discussed in our prep sessions. Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she was impressed despite herself. "You're confident in your abilities." "I'm confident in my preparation," I said. "I've spent 3 months studying your business model, analyzing your client needs, and developing solutions specifically designed for your challenges. I know this partnership can work because I've already done the homework." "And if the pilot projects fail?" "They won't," I said. "But if they do, you'll have lost 6 months of time with minimal financial risk. If they succeed, you'll have found a strategic partner who can help you scale more efficiently than hiring internally." Patricia looked at her colleagues, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, she turned back to me. "Ms. Klein," she said, "I think we have a deal. That night, I celebrated alone in my apartment with a bottle of champagne that cost more than I'd ever spent on alcohol in my life. I'd done it. I'd landed the biggest account in our company's history, positioned myself for a promotion that would more than double my salary, and proved that I could think bigger than Derek had ever imagined. But as I sat there, slightly drunk and overwhelmingly proud, I realized something interesting. I wasn't thinking about Derek at all. For the first time in months, my success felt like it belonged to me, not like a response to his rejection. That feeling lasted exactly 12 hours, until I got to work the next morning and checked my LinkedIn notifications. Derek had posted about his new job. Senior Marketing Director at Morrison & Associates. My champagne buzz evaporated instantly, replaced by a mixture of shock, rage, and something that felt almost like laughter. Because this was either the most incredible coincidence in the history of corporate America, or the universe had just handed me an opportunity for revenge so perfect that I couldn't have planned it better myself. Derek, who'd dismissed my career prospects, who'd claimed I wasn't ambitious enough for his trajectory, who'd replaced me with someone on his level professionally, was about to become my client. I was about to become his boss's boss, and he had no fucking idea what was coming. The 6 months between landing the Morrison account and actually starting the pilot project were the most strategically focused months of my entire life. I'd transformed from someone who played it safe to someone who planned 3 moves ahead in every conversation, every email, every professional interaction. It was like I'd unlocked some dormant part of my brain that understood corporate chess at a grandmaster level. I threw myself into preparation with the intensity of someone training for war, which, let's be honest, wasn't that far from the truth. I studied Morrison's organizational structure until I could draw their hierarchy from memory. I analyzed their recent projects, identified their key clients, memorized the names and backgrounds of every senior executive. I learned their corporate culture, their communication style, their decision-making processes, but most importantly, I researched Derek. Oh, I was subtle about it. Professional. I didn't stalk his social media or drive by his apartment like some scorned ex-girlfriend in a Lifetime movie. Instead, I did what any good consultant does when preparing to work with a new team. I studied his professional background, his role within the company, his recent projects and performance metrics. What I discovered was fascinating. Derek had joined Morrison 3 months after our breakup, right around the time I was putting together my initial pitch. His hiring had been Amanda's idea. She'd recommended him for the position based on his innovative approach to B2B marketing and his deep understanding of the tech sector. Innovative approach. Deep understanding. I nearly choked on my coffee when I read that in the internal memo Catherine had shared with me. Derek's most innovative marketing strategy had been suggesting they use different colors in their email templates. His deep understanding of the tech sector came from watching TechCrunch videos during his lunch breaks. But here's what made it even better. Derek's performance at Morrison had been mediocre at best. His first campaign had fallen short of targets by 15%. His second had been decent but not remarkable. His client satisfaction scores were hovering just above the threshold for needs improvement. Amanda had been making excuses for him in team meetings, according to the feedback I'd gathered during my preliminary meetings with Morrison's leadership team. Derek was struggling, and he had no idea that his professional lifeline was about to be cut by the woman he'd dismissed as insufficiently ambitious. The day I walked into Morrison's offices for my first official day as project lead was a Tuesday in June. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue suit that was professional but not flashy, paired with the kind of confident accessories that suggested I belonged in rooms where million-dollar decisions were made. I looked successful but not threatening, competent but not arrogant. It was corporate camouflage, designed to help me blend in until I was ready to reveal exactly who I was and what I was capable of. Patricia Morrison herself gave me the office tour, introducing me to key team members and explaining the dynamics of the 3 pilot projects I'd be overseeing. The first was a retail restructuring for a mid-sized chain that was struggling with e-commerce integration. The second was a manufacturing consolidation for a company that had grown through acquisitions and needed to streamline operations. The third was a financial services modernization project for a regional bank that was trying to compete with fintech startups. Each project has different challenges, Patricia explained as we walked through the open plan workspace. Different client personalities, different timelines, different risk factors. but they all require the same core competency, the ability to analyze complex financial data and translate it into actionable strategic recommendations. I nodded, taking mental notes about everything from the office layout to the coffee machine locations. Information was power, and I was collecting every piece I could find. "You'll be working primarily with our senior project managers," Patricia continued. "Jennifer Walsh on the retail account, Michael Torres on manufacturing, and David Kim on financial services. But you'll also collaborate with our marketing team on client communications and project positioning." And there it was, the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading for 6 months. "Our marketing director, Derek Chen, will be your main point of contact for all client-facing materials," Patricia said, completely oblivious to the way my heart rate had just spiked. "He's relatively new but comes highly recommended. Amanda speaks very highly of his strategic thinking." Derek Chen. He'd taken Amanda's last name, apparently. How fucking romantic. "I'm looking forward to working with him," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. We turned the corner into the marketing department, and there he was. Derek was sitting at a desk near the windows, wearing a button-down shirt I recognized from our shared closet, and typing intently on his laptop. He looked the same. Same perfectly styled hair, same confident posture, same expensive watch that he'd claimed was a investment piece. But there was something different about his energy. He looked smaller somehow, less certain, like someone who was trying harder than he used to have to. "Derek," Patricia called out, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Klein, our new strategic partner from Klein Associates." Derek looked up from his computer, and I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and absolute fucking horror in the span of about 3 seconds. His mouth opened slightly, like he was trying to say something but had forgotten how words worked. His skin went from its usual healthy tan to a pale shade that reminded me of expired milk. "Sarah?" he said finally, and his voice cracked slightly on my name. "Derek?" I replied, extending my hand with the kind of professional smile I'd practiced in my bathroom mirror. "It's so nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to working together." He stared at my outstretched hand like it was a snake that might bite him, then shook it with the enthusiasm of someone touching a dead fish. His palm was sweaty and his grip was weak, a far cry from the confident handshake he'd used to pride himself on. "Yes," he managed. "Working together? That's great." Patricia, completely oblivious to the psychological warfare happening right in front of her, continued with the introductions. "Sarah will be leading our pilot program with Klein Associates," she explained to Derek. "You'll be collaborating on client materials for 3 major accounts. This partnership could be transformative for our client services division." I watched Derek process this information, watched him realize what it meant. I wasn't just back in his life, I was back in his life in a position of authority. I was the strategic partner his company had hired to solve problems his marketing campaigns hadn't been able to address. I was quite literally his boss's boss. "Transformative," Derek repeated weakly. That's great." The beautiful thing about revenge is that it's best served with a smile and complete professional courtesy. Over the next 3 weeks, I established myself as everything Derek had claimed I wasn't: ambitious, strategic, capable of thinking bigger than he'd ever imagined. But I did it without ever directly referencing our history, without ever letting my personal feelings show, without giving him any ammunition to use against me. Instead, I simply excelled at my job. The retail restructuring project became my first showcase. The client, a regional clothing chain called Midwest Threads, was hemorrhaging money due to poor inventory management and an e-commerce platform that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never seen the internet. Their previous consultants had recommended generic cost-cutting measures: close underperforming stores, lay off staff, reduce inventory. Standard stuff that would have slowed their decline without addressing the fundamental problems. I spent 2 weeks analyzing their data and identified something everyone else had missed. Their problem wasn't too much inventory, it was the wrong inventory in the wrong places. Their supply chain was designed for a business model that had been obsolete for 5 years. They were trying to run a modern retail operation with a distribution system from the early 2000s. My solution was comprehensive, redesign their inventory management system, integrate their e-commerce platform with their physical stores, and create a customer data analytics program that would let them predict demand patterns with 85% accuracy. It was ambitious, expensive, and exactly the kind of forward-thinking strategy that would either save the company or become a very expensive lesson in overconfidence. Derek's role in this project was to create marketing materials that would help the client understand and buy into the proposed changes. His first draft of the presentation deck was adequate. Generic corporates speak about innovative solutions and strategic partnerships, illustrated with stock photos that had nothing to do with retail management. "I think we can do better than this," I said during our first project meeting, sliding Derek's draft back across the conference table. Derek's face flushed. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with it," I said calmly. "It's just not compelling. We're asking this client to invest $2 million in a complete operational overhaul. They need to understand not just what we're proposing, but why it's going to work." I opened my laptop and pulled up an alternative version I'd put together. What if we tell a story instead? Show them a day in the life of their business 6 months from now, when a customer can see their inventory in real time, when their distribution centers are talking to their online platform, when they can predict seasonal trends before their competitors even know the season is coming. I walked them through my version of the presentation, watching Derek's expression shift from defensive to confused to something that looked almost like respect. The other team members, Jennifer Walsh, the senior project manager, and 2 junior consultants, were nodding along, asking questions that showed they understood exactly what I was trying to accomplish. "This is much stronger," Jennifer said when I finished. "Derek, can you work with Sarah's framework and develop the visual elements?" Derek nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sure," he said. I can work with this." Over the next few days, Derek and I exchanged emails about design elements, messaging strategies, and presentation flow. Every interaction was perfectly professional, but I could feel his growing discomfort with the dynamic. He was used to being the creative lead, the one with the big ideas that everyone else implemented. Now he was adapting my vision, supporting my strategy, following my lead. The client presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Midwest Threads sent their CEO, CFO, and head of operations, 3 executives who'd been burned by consultants before and weren't particularly interested in hearing another pitch about paradigm shifts and synergistic solutions. I led the presentation, walking them through our analysis with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've done your homework better than everyone else in the room. I showed them exactly where their current system was failing, exactly how much money those failures were costing them, and exactly how our proposed solution would turn those costs into competitive advantages. Derek handled the marketing and communications portion of the presentation, using the framework I'd developed but adding his own design sensibility. I had to admit grudgingly that he was good at making complex ideas visually appealing. His slides were clean, professional, and effectively illustrated the transformation we were proposing. But the moment that defined the entire meeting came during the Q&A session, when the CEO asked about implementation timelines. "This all sounds impressive," he said, "but how do we know you can actually deliver these results in the time frame you're proposing?" Derek started to answer, probably with some generic reassurance about their team's capabilities, but I held up my hand to interrupt him. "Because I've already run a pilot version of this system," I said. "Last year, I worked with a similar client, a specialty retailer in the Pacific Northwest, and implemented a smaller-scale version of these same strategies. Their inventory costs dropped by 23% in the first 6 months, and their customer satisfaction scores increased by 15%. I can provide references and detailed case study data if you'd like." The room went quiet. Derek was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or something that looked almost like admiration. The Midwest Threads executives were leaning forward, suddenly much more interested in what I had to say. "You implemented this system yourself?" the CFO asked. "A version of it, yes," I said. "That project taught me what works, what doesn't, and how to avoid the common pitfalls that cause these transitions to fail. That's why I'm confident we can deliver results for Midwest Threads." 20 minutes later, we walked out of the meeting with a handshake agreement and a promise to have contracts ready by the following week. Derek was quiet during the elevator ride down to the parking garage, and I could practically see him processing what had just happened. "That was impressive," he said finally as we reached my car. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I mean it," he continued. "The way you handled their objections, the case study example. I didn't know you had that kind of experience." There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. Derek was realizing that he'd never really known what I was capable of, that he'd dismissed my potential without understanding what I actually did for a living. His surprise at my competence was both satisfying and infuriating. Satisfying because it proved how wrong he'd been about me, infuriating because it revealed how little attention he'd paid to my career while we were together. "There's a lot you didn't know about me?" I said, unlocking my car door. Derek stood there for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he just nodded and walked away. That night, I celebrated with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine while reviewing the feedback from our Morrison team. Patricia Morrison had sent a congratulatory email calling the Midwest Threads presentation exactly the kind of strategic thinking that sets us apart from our competitors. Jennifer Walsh had praised my innovative approach to client relationship management. Even the junior consultants had commented on how much they'd learned from watching me work. But the most interesting feedback came from Amanda Chen, who'd apparently heard about the presentation from Derek. She'd sent me a brief note congratulating me on the successful client meeting and suggesting we grab coffee sometime to discuss opportunities for collaboration. Amanda wanted to meet with me. The woman who'd stolen my boyfriend, who represented everything Derek thought he needed in a partner, who was supposedly on his level professionally, wanted to collaborate with me. It was almost too perfect. I scheduled coffee for the following Tuesday. Amanda chose a trendy place downtown, the kind of coffee shop where the baristas had art degrees and the lattes cost more than most people's lunches. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her laptop open and her phone face down beside a cup of something that looked more like dessert than coffee. In person, Amanda was exactly what I'd expected. Polished, confident, wearing the kind of effortlessly expensive outfit that suggested she'd never had to check her bank balance before making a purchase. But as we talked, I realized she wasn't quite the intimidating powerhouse I'd built up in my head. She was smart, certainly, and successful, but there was something almost needy about her energy. Like she was trying just a little too hard to impress me. "I've been following your work on the Morrison projects," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the coffee. "Patricia has been singing your praises. Honestly, I'm a little envious. I've been trying to land a partnership like this for years." Envious. Amanda Chen, Senior Vice President of Business Development, was envious of my consulting arrangement. The same Amanda Chen who Derek had left me for because she was more successful, more ambitious, more professionally accomplished. "It's been a great opportunity," I said carefully. "Morrison has an incredible team." "They do," Amanda agreed. "Though I have to admit, some of our recent hires have been adjustments." She didn't say Derek's name, but she didn't have to. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way she paused before saying, "adjustments," told me everything I needed to know. "Change is always challenging," I said, giving her an opening to elaborate. "Exactly," Amanda said, leaning forward slightly. "And sometimes people come into a new environment with expectations that don't quite match the reality of the role." Now we were getting somewhere. "That must be frustrating to manage." "It is," Amanda said, and for the first time she looked genuinely tired. "Especially when you've recommended someone for a position and they're not quite living up to their potential." Derek wasn't living up to his potential. The golden boy who'd claimed I wasn't ambitious enough, who'd discarded me for someone on his level professionally, was struggling to meet the basic expectations of his new job. And Amanda, successful, accomplished Amanda, was starting to realize she'd made a mistake. "I'm sure he'll find his footing," I said, the picture of professional diplomacy. "I hope so," Amanda replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. We spent another 20 minutes talking about business development strategies and potential collaboration opportunities, but the real conversation had already happened. Amanda was having doubts about Derek, both professionally and probably personally. The cracks in their relationship were starting to show, and I hadn't even had to do anything to cause them. Derek was self-destructing, and I had a front row seat. Over the next few weeks, I watched Derek's confidence erode in real time. The Midwest Threads project became a huge success. Their operational overhaul exceeded our projected results. Their customer satisfaction scores improved even more than we'd promised, and they'd already referred 2 other clients to Morrison. Patricia Morrison was talking about expanding our partnership, possibly bringing Klein Associates in as a preferred vendor for all their retail sector work. Meanwhile, Derek's other projects were struggling. A campaign he'd developed for a healthcare client had been poorly received, requiring expensive revisions and an awkward apology call from Amanda to smooth things over. His timeline for a financial services presentation had slipped by 2 weeks, forcing the team to scramble to meet their deadline. His creative work was becoming increasingly generic, like he'd lost confidence in his ability to generate original ideas. The breaking point came during our second major client presentation, this one for the manufacturing consolidation project. The client was a family-owned company that had grown through acquisitions, and they needed help streamlining operations across 12 different facilities in 8 states. It was complex, politically sensitive work that required both analytical precision and interpersonal finesse. Derek was responsible for creating presentation materials that would help the client's leadership team understand how consolidation would affect their workforce, their communities, and their company culture. It was exactly the kind of strategic communications challenge that should have played to his strengths. Instead, his first draft was a disaster. The presentation was tone-deaf, focusing on efficiency metrics without acknowledging the human cost of the proposed changes. His language was clinical when it should have been empathetic, generic when it should have been specific to their industry and company culture. It read like something generated by a consulting AI that had been trained exclusively on McKinsey case studies. "We can't present this to the client," I said during our team review meeting. "It completely misses the emotional reality of what we're asking them to do." Derek's face flushed red. "What do you mean, emotional reality?" "I mean that we're recommending they close facilities that have been part of their communities for decades," I said. "We're suggesting workforce reductions that will affect hundreds of families. Our presentation needs to acknowledge that reality while still making the business case for why these changes are necessary." "It's a business presentation," Derek said, his voice getting tighter, "not a therapy session." "It's both," I replied calmly. "And if we don't address the human element, we'll lose the client before we finish the first slide." The room was quiet. Jennifer Walsh was taking notes, probably for her post-meeting report to Patricia. The junior consultants were staring at their laptops, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. Derek was glaring at me like I'd personally insulted his entire professional identity. "Fine," he said finally. "What do you suggest?" I opened my laptop and pulled up an alternative framework I'd been developing. "What if we structure the presentation around their values? This company has been family-owned for 3 generations. They pride themselves on being good community partners, on treating employees like family. Let's show them how consolidation can actually strengthen those values, not compromise them." I walked the team through my approach, acknowledge the difficulty of the decisions, show how consolidation would make the remaining facilities more stable and secure, demonstrate the investment they'd be able to make in employee development and community partnerships once they'd streamlined operations. It was the same recommendation, but framed in terms of their identity and priorities, rather than abstract efficiency metrics. Derek listened without commenting, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like defeat. When I finished, he just nodded and said he'd revise the materials based on my feedback. The client presentation was a week later. Derek's revised materials were competent, not brilliant, but adequate. He'd incorporated my strategic framework and created visually appealing slides that told the story I'd outlined. But during the actual presentation, something happened that I hadn't expected. Derek choked, not literally but professionally. When the client's CEO asked about implementation timelines, Derek stumbled over his response. When they wanted more details about workforce transition planning, he looked to me to answer. When they questioned whether we really understood their company culture, Derek went silent entirely, leaving me to handle the objection. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone in the room that I was running the show, and Derek was just along for the ride. The client signed with us, but they specifically requested that I be the primary point of contact for all future communications. No offense. The CEO said to Derek as we were wrapping up, "But Sarah seems to really get what we're trying to accomplish here." Derek nodded and smiled and said all the right things, but I could see the humiliation in his eyes. This was his area of expertise, his professional strength, and he'd been completely outshined by his ex-girlfriend, the woman he'd dismissed as insufficiently ambitious. After the client left, Derek asked if we could talk privately. We went to one of Morrison's small conference rooms, the kind with glass walls that gave the illusion of privacy while ensuring everything remained visible to anyone walking by. Derek closed the door and stood there for a moment, looking like he was trying to figure out how to say whatever he'd brought me here to discuss. "I know what you're doing," he said finally. "I'm doing my job," I replied. "No, you're—" He paused, running his hand through his hair. "You're making me look incompetent. I'm not making you do anything, Derek. If you're struggling with your performance, that's between you and Amanda." At the mention of Amanda's name, Derek flinched slightly. "Amanda doesn't understand the situation." "What situation is that?" Derek stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with how much to reveal. "She thinks I've been distracted lately," he said finally, "that my work isn't meeting expectations. She's talking about bringing in additional support for my projects." Additional support. Corporate speak for, "We don't trust you to handle this alone anymore." "Maybe additional support would be helpful," I said neutrally. "I don't need additional support," Derek snapped. "I need—" He stopped himself, but I could fill in the blank. He needed me to stop being better at his job than he was. He needed me to go back to being the supportive girlfriend who celebrated his mediocre achievements and never outshined him in professional settings. "You need what?" I asked. Derek looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something that looked almost like fear. "I need to know that this isn't about us," he said quietly. "About what happened between us." And there it was. The conversation I'd been avoiding for months. The acknowledgement of the elephant that had been sitting in every conference room, every client meeting, every professional interaction we'd had since I'd walked into Morrison as his boss's boss. "This has nothing to do with us," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "This is about me doing the job I was hired to do." "Is it?" Derek asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to prove something." "What would I be trying to prove?" "That you're better than me," he said. "That I was wrong about you. That you're everything I said you weren't." The honesty of his response caught me off guard. Derek had always been good at deflecting, at reframing conversations to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. But now he was admitting, directly and without qualification, that he'd underestimated me. That his assessment of my potential had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. "I'm not trying to prove anything to you, Derek," I said finally. "I'm trying to build a career. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's something you need to work through on your own." Derek stared at me for another moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "This is my problem to solve." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said without looking back, "I was wrong about you. About your potential, your ambition, all of it. I'm sorry." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the conference room with the sweetest apology I'd ever received. But here's the thing about revenge. Sometimes getting what you want doesn't feel the way you expected it to feel. Derek's admission should have been triumphant, vindicating, the perfect culmination of months of strategic planning and professional excellence. Instead, it just felt hollow. I'd proven my point. I'd demonstrated my capabilities, exceeded every expectation, and forced Derek to confront how completely he'd misjudged me. I'd become his boss's boss, watched him struggle in his new role, and received the acknowledgement I'd been seeking. So why didn't it feel like winning? The answer came 6 weeks later, during Morrison's quarterly all-hands meeting. I was presenting the results of our 3 pilot projects to the entire company, 200 employees packed into their main conference room, listening to me explain how our partnership had exceeded every projected metric. Midwest Threads had become a case study in successful retail transformation. The manufacturing consolidation had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. The financial services modernization project had generated enough cost savings to fund 3 additional innovation initiatives. Patricia Morrison introduced me as the strategic partner who's helping us redefine what's possible in the consulting space. Amanda Chen called our collaboration a perfect example of how the right partnership can elevate everyone involved. The room erupted in applause when I finished, and I could see genuine respect in the faces around me. Derek was sitting in the back row, clapping politely but looking like he was attending his own funeral. After the presentation, during the networking reception that followed, I found myself in conversation after conversation with Morrison employees who wanted to understand how we'd achieved such dramatic results. Senior partners were asking about expanding our collaboration. Junior consultants were requesting mentorship meetings. Amanda herself pulled me aside to discuss a potential joint venture that could triple our current contract value. I should have been euphoric. This was everything I'd worked toward, everything I'd dreamed about during those dark weeks after Derek left. I'd become exactly the kind of successful, ambitious, professionally accomplished woman he'd claimed to want. I'd exceeded his expectations so completely that his own career was now dependent on my success. But standing there in Morrison's gleaming conference room, surrounded by people who respected my expertise and valued my contributions, I realized something that completely changed how I understood the past year of my life. I wasn't thinking about Derek at all. The success I was celebrating, the recognition I was receiving, the opportunities I was being offered, none of it was about him anymore. Somewhere along the way, my revenge plot had transformed into something else entirely. It had become my career, my identity, my actual life. The woman who'd stood in that apartment 15 months ago, crying over a breakup and planning strategic vengeance, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had defined herself in relation to Derek's opinion, had measured her worth by his standards, had built her ambitions around proving him wrong. This woman, the one standing in Morrison's conference room accepting congratulations and planning her next career move, didn't need Derek's validation anymore. I'd spent so much energy trying to prove I was irreplaceable that I'd forgotten the most important lesson. You can't be irreplaceable to someone who never valued you in the first place. Derek caught up with me as I was leaving the reception, probably his last chance to talk before I headed back to my own office, and our professional relationship returned to its normal, carefully managed boundaries. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear something different in his voice. Not the defeated tone from our conference room conversation, but something that sounded almost like relief. "Can I buy you a drink?" I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. Derek was still handsome, still well-dressed, still carrying himself with that confident posture that had attracted me in the first place. But he looked tired, older somehow, like someone who'd been running toward something for so long that he'd forgotten why he'd started running. "One drink," I said. We went to a bar near Morrison's office, the kind of upscale place where corporate types went to decompress after challenging meetings. Derek ordered his usual overpriced IPA. I got a glass of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries. "Congratulations," Derek said, raising his glass. "On the presentation, the success, all of it. You deserve it." "Thank you," I said and meant it. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us apparently trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation. Finally, Derek spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Amanda and I broke up." I felt a brief spike of vindication, but it faded almost immediately. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" Derek asked, with a slight smile that suggested he knew better. "Actually, yes," I said, surprising myself with how true it was. "Breakups suck, regardless of the circumstances." Derek nodded slowly. "It was mutual, mostly. We realized we were together for the wrong reasons. She was impressed by my ambition, I was impressed by her success, but we never actually liked each other very much." "That sounds familiar," I said, then immediately regretted it. "Yeah," Derek said. "It does." He took a long sip of his beer, then looked at me directly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he said. "About us. About what happened. About the things I said when we broke up." "Derek, no, let me finish," he said. "I was wrong about everything. Not just about your potential or your ambition, but about what I thought I wanted. I was so focused on finding someone who looked successful on paper that I never appreciated what I actually had. I could feel that familiar ache in my chest, the one that had defined so many months of my life. But now it felt different, not like a wound that was still bleeding, but like a scar that was finally finished healing. "I spent this whole year trying to prove you wrong," I said quietly, "trying to become the woman you said you needed." "And you did," Derek said. "You became everything I claimed I wanted and more. But the thing is, Sarah, you were already enough. You were always enough. I was just too stupid and insecure to see it." The vindication I'd been seeking for 15 months was finally here, delivered with complete sincerity and genuine remorse. Derek was admitting that he'd been wrong about me, wrong about what mattered, wrong about everything. It was the moment I'd fantasized about during every sleepless night, every strategic planning session, every professional triumph. And it felt anticlimactic. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "But I need you to know something." This year wasn't about proving you wrong. It was about proving something to myself. Derek raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean that somewhere along the way, I stopped caring about your opinion and started caring about my own. I discovered that I actually am ambitious. I actually do want to think bigger. I actually am capable of things I'd never imagined. But not because you told me I wasn't. Because I decided I wanted to be. I finished my wine and looked at Derek. This man who'd shaped so much of my recent life, who'd been the catalyst for so much growth and change and professional success. He looked smaller now, not physically, but somehow diminished, like someone who'd been carrying around expectations that were too heavy for him. I don't hate you, I said, which seemed to surprise him. I thought I did for a while. But I don't. You did me a favor, actually. How's that? You forced me to figure out who I actually am when I'm not trying to be who someone else wants me to be. Derek smiled, a real smile this time, not the practiced one he used in professional settings. And who is that? Someone who doesn't need to be irreplaceable to anyone but herself. We finished our drinks and talked for another hour about safe topics, work, mutual friends, our respective career plans. Derek was thinking about leaving Morrison, maybe going back to a smaller company where he could find his footing again. Amanda was being supportive but professional, managing his transition with the kind of clinical efficiency that had probably characterized their entire relationship. As we were getting ready to leave, Derek asked one more question. Do you think we could be friends? Eventually, I mean. After everything that's happened, I considered it. The idea of Derek as a friend, someone I grabbed coffee with occasionally, someone whose career updates I saw on LinkedIn without feeling a spike of competitive rage, seemed not just possible but actually appealing. We'd been good together once, before the relationship became about everything it wasn't instead of everything it was. Maybe, I said. Ask me again in 6 months. Derek laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in longer than I could remember. Fair enough. Walking back to my car that night, I realized that the story I'd been telling myself for the past year was finally complete. Not because I'd gotten revenge on Derek, but because I'd stopped needing it. The woman who'd planned his professional downfall had evolved into someone who didn't measure her success by his failure anymore. 6 months later, Derek did ask me again about being friends. By then, he'd found a new job at a startup where his skills were better suited to the company culture. Amanda had been promoted to executive vice president, and our professional partnership had expanded into one of Morrison's most profitable divisions. I'd been promoted to principal consultant and was considering starting my own firm. And yes, we became friends. Not close friends, but the kind of people who could grab coffee occasionally and genuinely enjoy each other's company. Derek was happier in his new role, more confident, more like the person I'd originally fallen for. I was building the kind of career I'd never imagined possible, working with clients who valued my expertise and challenged me to keep growing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just becoming so completely yourself that the person who couldn't see your worth becomes irrelevant to your story. Derek had been wrong about me being irreplaceable, but not in the way he'd meant it. I wasn't irreplaceable to him. I was irreplaceable to me. And that, it turned out, was the only opinion that had ever really mattered.